This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I'll reiterate again that I have signed up the podcast for the podcastawards.com contest. Links will be in the show notes. If you could please nominate and vote for the podcast, that will give the podcast exposure to a number of people who would otherwise not hear it. I want to thank my new supporters, Sarah and Nick, as well as my ongoing supporters, Libby, Dawn, Michael, Ian, James, John, Joel, and James. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. As always, I ask for you to rate and review the podcast on podchaser.com or the Apple Podcast Store. I want to talk a little bit about reviewing the podcast. An interesting side effect of having a podcast like this one is that most of the commentary is really complimentary. I'm actually really honestly interested in hearing critical feedback in a graceful way. So I wanted to mention a pretty honest review on podchaser.com from KMCKS. They point out two things. One, something I've heard from a few other people that I will try to fix, is the music has been way too loud, and that is my poor mixing abilities, so that's not reflective on Mike T. That's me. I will work on fixing that. The other thing they point out is I can have a tendency to insert my own story into other people's experiences. And that's a valid point. I get what they are talking about there, and so I have taken that note. The thing I am trying to get across here is I am honestly interested in critical feedback given in a graceful way. The podcast generally gets very, very favorable reviews. Every once in a while we get a 1-star review, and I would love for those 1-star reviews to have reasons why. How can we make it better? How can we improve? That's ultimately what I'm interested in. So please rate and review in all honesty and tell me how you feel. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's podcast. My guest today is Thomas. Thomas is a missionary kid. He is also the brother of a previous guest, Jimmy, and we're hearing that family story from a different perspective. There was divorce in the family early and mental health issues, as well as the untimely death of Thomas's mother in his teen years. And you can just hear the heartache in Thomas's story as he describes the process of being a part of a very dedicated, committed Christian family and having that faith slip away. Another thing that comes through in the story is just the precociousness of Thomas as a kid, as well as his brothers. They seem to be incredibly bright. They all went into technical fields, science and development. And I have a particular soft heart for precocious kids who grow up in a very highly regimented religious environment, such as an evangelical family. That particular combination is really, really difficult. The kid is asking reasonable questions, and rather than getting reasonable answers, they can get hostility back from the adults around them. Thomas tells his story with incredible vulnerability and incredible honesty. I think you might want to get the tissues out. This one is a bit of a tearjerker. Here is my conversation with Thomas. Thomas, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So, Thomas, this is an interesting interview in that you are the brother of a previous guest of mine, Jimmy. And as you just mentioned off mic, I think what'll be fascinating about this is we'll get two perspectives on both of you going through a deconversion process at different times, and both of you kind of communicating with each other through that process.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with just what was your faith tradition? What was it like for you while you were a believer?
Yeah, so like Jimmy went over, I'm assuming some people might interact with this episode first, so I'll go over it. So we grew up in a very Christian family, I would say. It's sort of broad in its the flavors, some Presbyterian, some it's a lot of missions, a lot of linguistics, and so people sort of fell where they fell. For me, I'm the youngest in the family, so Jimmy's 8 years older than me. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
when he mentions being in Korea and coming back to the States, so most of my life is the coming back to the States part.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. So a pretty radically different perspective, I would imagine.
yeah, yeah. So sort of my indoctrination period was when he had already formed a lot of his ideas over in Korea, being influenced by the people my mom was hanging out with, and I got that influence later, more indirectly, just because I was younger. So the Southern Baptist officially church that I grew up in, I got that full blast. Um,
Right.
And so the way I've come to think of it is I don't actually know like how strongly my dad holds things and how he not justifies or rationalizes, but like makes sense of him being a guy in the world and then him holding these faith-based beliefs. I haven't had those deep um, conversations with him, and growing up in this church, I basically just became a fundamentalist from the beginning.
You don't know any better. Yeah.
Exactly. And my dad went to seminary. He knows about lots of the southern flavors of Christianity, Protestant Christianity, and the way he described our church was as like more of like a Bible church. I don't know what that means, but I guess that's one of the labels that people use.
I think that's very common. What you see a lot of are churches that call themselves non-denominational
Mm-hmm.
or a Bible church. And almost always, obviously there are exceptions, but almost always that means Baptist under the hood.
Yeah, and because I was in it, it was like my family's team. This is the way we do it. There were some conversations about, okay, I'm noticing there are lots of different denominations, and so why do those exist? And I would have those conversations with my mom, and I don't know, maybe it's just the natural thing, but you think your team is the one, and you're like,
Right.
some people think like there are many paths, but my family didn't think that way. Like we thought Protestants thought close enough, but Catholics were misguided or whatever.
I sometimes describe that as the concentric circles. So Christians will talk about, believers in general, the church in
Mm-hmm.
general, and then they'll separate Catholics and Protestants, and then
Mm-hmm.
they'll separate evangelicals or fundamentalists and non or progressive or mainline, and then they'll go down to their specific denomination like Southern Baptist, and
Mm-hmm.
they'll say, well, our church, and
Yeah,
then it's like
exactly.
our family, and there's just and you really, the truth is it gets down to one individual.
Mm-hmm.
It's my version of Christianity
Yeah.
that ultimately is what a person believes.
Yeah, and then you're reading scripture or hearing a sermon and they're talking about the church, and well, that's all Christians.
Right.
It's like, so simultaneously you're differentiating yourself from everyone who basically thinks like you, and also getting the positive aspects of being united. Um, you can feel good about it, but also stand, to the side of everyone else. It seems like you have a lot of Pentecostals on your show, and you talk about how people, if you're a deep thinker in it, you're going to go one of, I think you say, three routes, and Pentecostal's one, Calvinist is another, and then what was
Yeah,
the third?
more of a moralism
Okay,
route, just like a holiness
yeah,
direction. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, but I didn't start interacting with Pentecostals until youth group age, so teens. But they were definitely around, and that was, the differences in beliefs definitely played a role in my doubts, I guess.
So in your, I'm assuming, teen years, then when
Mm-hmm.
you hit youth group, you're beginning to see that there are people who practice Christianity in a different way
Mm-hmm.
than you do. And what questions are you asking yourself about that?
Well, you know, when people are talking about actually having seen demons, um,
Right, right. Yes,
you know,
yes.
we come from a bit of a sci-fi fantasy family, and so there wasn't a full rejection of worldly things. My dad was pretty practical. He enjoyed, you know, lots of different kinds of fiction. He would just
Hmm.
be, you know, a Christian, but also not fully separated, as is often called for in fundamentalist situations. So yeah, I was exposed to lots of different kind of art and fantastical thinking, and you know the overlap with demonic possession and whatever the gradients of that are. That got my attention when somebody just like 2 years older than me is talking about having seen a demon in like a poorly lit room where his
Right.
friend was being influenced. And I don't know, I wasn't necessarily a skeptical thinker from the beginning, but when I was young, there were lots of things that didn't make sense to me. And I would just sort of put it off by trusting the adults because they were, you know, you're a kid, they're carrying everything for you anyway. And yeah, so it's not like my doubts formed as a teenager, but then you steadily enter the world and interact with more people than just your family and classmates. And as that happens, you get bits and pieces that, if you're paying attention, if you're not being, you know, fully influenced by cognitive dissidence and dissonance, um, you have the chance to paint a really weird, like, collage of stuff that doesn't jive.
Right, right. You know, there are so many ways that people have attempted to express this. In my 10 steps to deconversion, I talk about precipitating events. You just
Mm-hmm.
have these moments of a blip in the matrix where you're like, well, that doesn't quite compute.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that your faith is over at that point in time, you know, years, decades later,
Yeah.
maybe. But it's just those moments of, that doesn't quite fit. Tim Sledge calls them the exceptions to the rule of faith.
Hmm.
I had a guest on named Amy Logan. She said, well, I'm just going to put that up on the shelf and not think about it anymore.
Yeah.
And like, it's that kind of thing where you just have those moments where you do recognize this weird puzzle piece doesn't fit my picture of what Christianity is supposed to be, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
not quite yet prepared to deal with that.
Yeah, there seem to be, I don't know how many there are, but many mechanisms of explaining away things in the mysteries of the divine. Um, you know, we're mere mortals. We're not
Hmm.
intended to understand uh, necessarily the whole will of God. Um, you know, from a secular standpoint, yeah, humans are not evolved to understand how things work. We just happen to have the ability to, you know, create civilization and discover the scientific method and converge on aspects of reality. That's not necessary for life. So, of course, things are going to be mysterious. But when you're religious, it's baked in. It's there from the beginning. This is, when you're in a faith based religion, at least, it's a feature.
Yeah, I know I've quoted this a bunch of times, but Jennifer Michael Hecht talks about that doubt is a feature, not a bug of
Mm-hmm.
Christianity, because Christianity is based on belief.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that's based purely on belief, the flip side of that coin is going to be doubt.
Mm-hmm.
So you have some precipitating events, you have some recognition of what doesn't quite fit with your picture of what Christianity ought to be. What happens next?
Well, I guess I'm sort of skipping over stuff. So I'll go back to my weird family. uh,
Okay.
so we had a divorce early on. So I would be visiting my mom, and she was a depressed person, um,
Hmm.
and struggled with that my whole life. Um, that we overlapped. She did it and end up dying when I was young. I don't know if Jimmy
Oh,
talked with you about that at all. Um,
yeah, I'm very sorry, Thomas.
yeah, it's all right. I understand you lost somebody as well, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
but I was definitely an adult at that time, so it was maybe
yeah,
maybe not quite as dramatic. So,
yeah. So I would go and visit my mom, and she was this very realistic person, and I would ask her questions, like adult questions, and she would figure out ways to answer me. So
hmm.
I was like 8 years old, and I had a good understanding of what happened in Vietnam, stuff stuff like that.
Right, I
Uh,
gotcha. Yeah,
and it wasn't an all-encompassing education from her, but it was topically whatever was going on. And when you have access to information like that from a young age, it just, the picture that you paint in your mind to make sense of things doesn't tie together,
mm,
especially with the faith. So I was talking about how I had doubts earlier on. Well, the Bible talks a lot about human nature and how it gets corrupted, and you see that in the church. And that gets explained away by, well, of course, we're humans. People are going to be the way we are or whatever. And
right.
there are going to be these few virtuous people who carry us and who are actually pious and all that. And I saw that too. Um, but the money in the church thing, that really, even from a young age of like understanding what tithing is, like the concept of tithing didn't bother me. It totally made sense that in the early church, it was people meeting in houses and feeding each other and washing each other's feet. And, they would take care of each other in the community. And that would be literally taking what you have and giving it to people you care about because you share this thing. And as a kid, I recognized the beauty in that.
Right.
But then you pass the plate around and it's like, well, at least 10%. And my church had a way of rolling one capital campaign right into the next.
Yes.
And I,
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm talking about it out loud. It makes me sound like this really cynical kid. But maybe I was. I'd see my dad writing these checks and I saw how hard he worked, and I saw what the money got used for, at least some. And it was just this expansionist way of thinking. And
Yeah.
it's like, is this really? I saw that we were um, supporting missions. We'd
Hmm.
hear from those families, and my family had been one of those families. I've got aunts and uncles and cousins still doing it, and grandparents who just retired, and
Right.
that sort of thing. So I was biased toward missions, I think, as a kid because it's what the Bible indicated you were supposed to be doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
You do
Yeah.
your works in your local community. You stand out as a Christian through your character, um, and you support people who go out in the world and spread the good word. But then when you're just building buildings so that you can pack in more people, and it's like an ego interchurch ego thing. So like who can expand and be more successful. I had a problem with that even as a, 10-year-old.
Right.
So that those sorts of things of like, yeah, human nature is corrupt. Sure, yes, we're all humans, but how come so many of you seem to be corrupt or motivated by the wrong things?
Right. I definitely don't think that you were a cynical child. I've had a number of people on who talk about, you know, early on in childhood or preteen
Mm-hmm.
times, recognizing the flaws in what is being stated is the goal
Yeah,
versus what is actually being done. And it sounds like you were just sensitive to that, right? You were
yeah,
aware that there was some disparity.
yeah. That hypocrisy, at least apparent hypocrisy, whatever their intentions were.
It's interesting. I want to explore just for a second your perspective on missions because you had so much family that was currently at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and or retired from, and your family directly had
Mm-hmm.
come back from mission field, and so you wanted to focus that money towards mission, but it sounds like the church was more focused towards growth locally and literally with the building.
Yeah, well, as a kid, I'd say I didn't really have an agenda. I was just seeing what people were doing and agreeing with it or disagreeing with it. That tithe money bought a lot of pizza that I ate. And I had a good time with my friends in youth group. And, I guess we did some useful things, but it mostly seems like a place to go to not get in trouble and further your indoctrination. As a kid, like, I think my dad spoke highly of missions, and he would himself support families that we knew who were young and going to Southeast Asia, as I do my air quotes, to do missions in places where Christians really were persecuted. Because I grew up hearing about persecution and how that seemed to be like almost a necessary characteristic of being a Christian.
Mm.
But then when you're in the South and like everyone's a Christian, even if they're not actually practicing, they're culturally a Christian. Like it felt hard to feel persecuted. Like trying to
Mm.
make sense of that, and I'm going to school and there are kids who aren't Christians and they're gonna make fun of me. Well, it turns out nobody cared. But then I later on go to lunch when I was visiting my grandfather, a linguist, a lifetime professor, professional linguist, translator guy who, could read and write Greek and Hebrew and speak some of it. And a super duper plugged in guy. I was eating lunch with a guy from Timor who had been tortured for his faith.
Mm.
And I met this guy pretty much as I was losing, like agreeing with myself that I wasn't doing this anymore. Um, that took a long time, but it was like pieces of it were peeled away. But even though so much of it was gone, I still respected this guy because he had faith. you know,
Right.
I didn't. And you talk about how, I guess, mostly apologists, but Christians who are still diehard believers look at people who lose their faith and they say, "Oh, they must never have had faith." I was trying really hard the whole time. Like I'm recalling details that I didn't go over. I went to a really conservative Christian school for first through sixth grade in the South, based on we had the Becca books, and I I don't know. It was a pretty wild time. Like I read and write pretty well because of it, but then there's all the baggage that comes with it, all the
Right.
reinforcement of hell and all that. And then I went public school after that, and it was a way different path. And I had all of those doubts while I was in that Christian school setting with all the variety of kids who were there. You had the church kids, and then you had the kids who couldn't go to public school because they had been kicked out of all of them in the area. And so they're now at this private school. Like, those were the kids that I wanted to hang out with.
They're interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, the kids wearing pipe leg jeans and listening to Eminem in elementary school, like rapping out on the recess. Like, those people were way more interesting to me
Yeah.
than the straight laced kids who were trying to do the same thing I was trying to do.
So again, Thomas, I think that is super common that people describe trying really hard to live out
Mm-hmm.
Christianity, that they feel compelled to do the right thing, to do the gospel, and
Mm-hmm.
yet feel guilty that they aren't able to do it well enough. They feel guilty they don't evangelize. They feel guilty they don't read the Bible enough. And
Yeah.
it's just this vicious circle of of kind of self-loathing that
Yeah.
happens. Yeah.
Piles of shame. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So yeah, that I think is very common as well.
My mom got diagnosed with cancer when I was 12, I think, 11 or 12. And it was in there a while, I guess you'd say. So,
Oh man,
yeah, she died when I was 13.
I am so sorry, man. That must be utterly devastating at that age.
Yeah.
I mean, it's devastating always, but the topic of grief without faith
Yeah.
has been coming up over and over and over again. So I think it's really, really important. I don't know where you were at 13, whether
Mm-hmm.
you had faith or you were already doubting, but when you don't have the comforting thoughts,
Yeah.
the comforting beliefs, and you lose someone, that grief is more poignant and in some ways more pure, right?
Yeah.
You are able to truly let go. You're able to truly feel the loss.
Mm-hmm.
Let yourself be sad and angry and grief.
Yeah.
And so that topic comes up a lot. So you don't have to apologize in any way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. People experience it all kinds of different ways. And I think just, obviously she was my mom, but she had played this really strange role in my life. Um, as a detached mentor. Like she wasn't in a place where she could take care of me or us. Um, but I mean, she was a missionary kid. She was born in Mexico City because her family was in the mountains in Mexico.
Mm.
And so she grew up with a tribe, like the tribe that resisted the Catholics. Like everybody else got converted, and then there was this one, So she was up in the mountains with that upbringing, detached from her homeland, I guess, and culture. And then she would cycle up for the summers and be on the res in Oklahoma because we're part Cherokee. We're a part of the Cherokee Nation, and there's a linguistics institute there that they were involved with. So I guess this is de-anonymizing me, but yeah. So she had this weird childhood, and you've probably heard missionary kids are as fucked up as preachers' kids or,
Right.
the kids of
Yes.
principals or cops, they're all of these bring their own challenges, but she was solidly a third culture kid, a person with no home. And I feel that way, even though, I was born in Korea and I grew up in the South to a Korean family, basically. Not quite a Korean family, but heavily influenced. So we weren't like other people. My hometown, like I don't belong to that place at all, and it is a weird thing to have, like as a sense of identity. People draw from that so much, but I'm this free floating person, and my mom was
Mm.
too, and it like really was a challenge for her. I think it was a challenge for her siblings as well, who were in the same context. Only one of them is still alive. Like her youngest brother, he joined the circus.
Interesting.
Probably did a bunch of hard drugs. Became an IT guy and died young. Not as young as her, but he lived a rough, probably, I imagine, tormented life. And then the guy who survived that is the guy who went into missions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Thomas, this is an incredible story. I'm trying to keep all the pieces in my mind. This is amazing. But
Yeah.
I just want to say, your mom sounds like just an absolutely amazing person.
Yeah. Yeah. She certainly got cut short.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, people have all these aphorisms or whatever about even if you don't think people are in heaven or whatever, they live on through you, and that's technically true. Um, I have some of the same burdens she has,
Yeah.
uh, and that's genetic, I imagine, and also just similar but different beginnings. Uh, and then she was the refuge for me, but she was also not equipped to be that.
Mm.
So, yeah, she's definitely still around in us. She had such a huge impact, but she died in her 40s, and the
Mm.
tail end of her life was not pleasant. And that's what
I'm
I
so
was.
sorry, man.
It's all right. It's all right. Even in the, pre-diagnosis, she was having a rough time.
Yeah.
She was a very empathetic person, and took a lot of that on, and didn't have the support to make sense of things. Yeah, but then she died, and it was interesting where I actually got real support from. And my pastor was there. I appreciated him being there, but at the same time, I was like, that fucking guy can't do anything. That's
Yes.
like my whole childhood. I view him as like, okay, he's the leader of my church. He's like one of the most important people in my life. And he's sitting there in my living room, and it's like, man, he is useless. And
Mm.
like, he kind of looked like he felt that way. Um, like in his posture and all that. And my classmates, I mean, the youth people were very helpful, people my age. But my public school classmates, man, the love that they showed me.
Mm. It's the people in our lives who actually do love us
Yeah,
that that's the real thing, man. That's the magic. That's the real deal.
yeah, and I felt it too. Yeah, it was intense. And it wasn't just them. Like, there was the initial eighth grade. Like, everyone in my class, made this nice card and whatever. And this girl who had a crush on me went to the funeral and, like, basically represented the people I cared about. There were all these other people there talking about her being in a better place. Like, I knew she was just gone.
Mm.
There was nothing else.
Mm.
And it's like the thing you feel immediately and recognize immediately is, at least for me, I'm never going to see her again.
Mm.
It's like they go on a trip and you just know they're not coming back and they're out of communication. And it doesn't matter, if they're somewhere else. They're gone for you.
And for years, I don't know what your experience, Thomas, but for years, I would see something, hear something, and think, "Oh, mom would love that," and oh, she's gone. Like it just hits you again and again and again. Like it
Yeah,
is relentless.
that happened later. Yeah, I think because I didn't get enough of the right support early on. I didn't really grieve. I didn't grieve properly, at least.
Mm.
So it took about a decade for me to be able to say anything about her without crying. And then after that, I went like 2 years without crying at all.
Mm.
Like, definitely impactful stuff that
Yeah.
I wasn't processing properly. And like this whole time, I'm living my life like I'm becoming a person. Um,
Right.
and it definitely overshadows things. Um, but I got a lot of support. Like my classmates for years supported me.
That's amazing.
I felt that love, and these were people who didn't really understand what they were doing,
Right.
and none of them cared about God. Yeah, and that was very impactful. So I went to public school, 7th grade. That was right after the diagnosis. She died when I was in the 8th grade. Then I do 2 years at my local high school, and cross country, track. Some of my youth group people overlapped into high school. You're getting that mix. You're seeing
Yeah.
how people behave in different contexts, and then I was in the Boy Scouts, just like my brothers, same troops,
Okay.
same troop,
Yeah.
and you're getting a wide variety of wild people. uh,
Yeah.
yeah, boys in their most intense, like
Right.
destructive, chaotic
Yeah.
period.
Here, let's give children knives.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
And
fire.
fire. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that was hugely impactful too, because that was like an overlap of adjacent church people. So, not people in my church, but other churches that we were affiliated with, plus public school kid people. One of my friends was Catholic, and he was in another troop. And
Yeah.
he was just such a kind, fun guy. Um, I spoke with him pretty recently for the first time in like a decade, but
Yeah.
yeah, he had a big impact on me. But just you're I paid attention in church. I paid attention to my dad. I got the lessons of like you need to examine who you're around, and you need to look at people who are doing things correctly. Your your judgment of what is correct can change, and it certainly did for me in this process. And I found that the people whose character I respected they were mostly not involved in the church, and these different avenues provided these examples to me, like a coach who's just a secular person, just a nice person who's in it because they love kids and they want the best for the future. Like, I mean, what more can you ask than that?
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
Sounds like a well socialized person to me.
You're a kid, you lose your mom, you're devastated.
Yeah.
You feel like you're a person with no home. You feel like maybe you still do, but at the time also you feel like you don't have a place that is yours.
Yeah.
Where I'm headed here is, of course you're going to self-medicate.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
that's,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what people do. Human beings hate pain. They are going to self-medicate. I don't know if that was where you were headed, but
No, that was actually a perfect thing to say because I guess I will have to jump back and forth in chapters of my life topically. So my dad started running before his second divorce. So we had that 5-ish, 6-ish years of unhelpful step family with the Christian schooling. And I think he was sort of girding up his loins, as they say,
okay.
sharpening up his mind, preparing himself for this divorce. Because it did take a while, but he saw that I was in a bad situation with the step family and like a weird situation with the school. In the 4th grade, I came home with my science book, and I just like very confidently explained to him that humans weren't mammals. Like humans are like mammals, but we're different because we have souls. And this was my science book,
Right.
and it was like I think that got him thinking maybe I should go to a different school.
Okay.
So
Right.
I find out much later he's got this process in his mind of like, oh, we need to leave this situation we're going and looking at duplexes that are being built, and I have no idea why. Like, I'm thinking he's buying it as a rental property, but it's like, no, this is where we're about to move.
Okay.
But he started running. I think he knew he needed something, and he did that. And then it was a pretty long divorce, so he kept running. And this is me moving from childhood into teens. And so I would ride my bike with him, and then as soon as I could reasonably, I joined him running. So I was a runner when my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and when she died, and the you know years that followed, and I kept running, and
Mm.
it saved me.
Man, you are speaking to me, Thomas. Like I cannot watch Forrest Gump without breaking into tears every time.
Yeah,
Every time, like he's in so much grief, and he just runs. He's just run.
yeah,
It's just so simple. It's such a pure thing to do.
yeah,
I know most of the audience is like, I don't get these people, but like
yeah.
it absolutely is so important to me. My mental health, my physical health. So it sounds like that was the case for you as well.
And I didn't realize what it was doing for me. I kept it up pretty well through high school, but then freshman year of college, I dropped it. And my, as you said, coping mechanism, which was a perfect segue. Yeah, you have to cope, you have to survive, you have to find something that can put you into a place where at least you're not suffering so much.
Mm.
A reprieve. And eventually, if it's a healthy enough coping mechanism, that reprieve turns into processing. And it requires an overtime element. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, the hypnotic aspect of running is so wonderful. It engages you, especially I like trail running. I think you mentioned liking trail running.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it ties you up, and especially if you're in a beautiful place, it's very helpful. But I mean, you may have heard of the game World of Warcraft.
Think I've heard
I
about that before. Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of the first successful big multiplayer RPGs online, and I went. I'm again jumping all around, but I'm a gamer. I went to that high school Jimmy mentioned, the sort of magnet school. All three of us went there, and I don't know, World of Warcraft came out while I was there, and it became this like proxy world that I lived in where I could be successful and
Mm.
step outside of my own problems. And it really helped that it was full of real people all around the world. And my friends, I had friends who lived on the hall with me or around the school, they would play. And so we would be like real people playing locally. And also, it was like an extended LAN party for those of you who are familiar with the concept. It was like a massive party that was also a video game um, that you could drop into. It was an alternate dimension you could just drop into and hang out and do fun things and win sparkly prizes, basically. And that had such an appeal that, it was a problem in college. My grades were not always good because, like, this alternate reality was more, uh, had more for me than normal life for a while, which is crazy.
Well, it's not crazy, Thomas. I mean, I had friends that were completely absorbed by that game. So
Yeah,
it's the same premise of addiction, right?
yeah,
They're the game designers are literally spending millions of dollars on psychology
yeah.
research to
True.
to make sure that they will hook you in and keep
True.
you for hour upon hour upon hour.
Yeah, so that the coping mechanisms definitely shifted. So I didn't really have running anymore. I would do it occasionally, but I wasn't maintaining it at the level that you need to to have access to like the deep stuff. Like there are, my wife hates this, but because people say it so often now, but there are so many levels, to it, and you do
Yes.
have to go up a few steps before you get to the understanding of what it does for people.
And there's a massive social aspect to
Yeah.
the game like that. I think that's what, particularly World of Warcraft, which, as you say, was one of the first really successful ones, is
Yeah.
that people were connecting.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking to people and building friendships. I had friends who, were building, romantic relationships and having them fall apart.
Yeah.
It was amazing. So I wasn't a gamer like that. So I kind of observed it as an outsider, but I really do understand the pull that has on people.
Yeah, it was pretty wild because you'd recognize that it wasn't real, but it felt so real because the connections were real. And if the connections are real, then who cares? Um, and the game is still around, but it's not what it was because the community's not there. It's one of those games that requires the community, and a lot of them are like that. But this one was like that's all it was.
Right.
Yeah. So I quit that game. There have been several expansions, but I quit right before the second expansion, and sort of life was happening. The financial crash had occurred right before I graduated. So I went from thinking that I had this awesome job lined up, most likely with this company I had a co op education position with. Um, yeah, I won't mention the name, but they're a big pharmaceutical company that does decent work, really good work, actually.
Sure.
And I was the second to last person hired, and I was not a full time position. I was still a student, and when I started being hired, they were saying we're going to double the population of this site over the next 5 years. Okay, I will show up to work and do a good job, and I will have a job. That's what I was thinking. And then
Right.
by the time I was done being hired, uh, they had done their first hiring freeze, which held until they shut down that site. Because that industry it was not completely restructured, but it was significantly restructured in a way that impacted the type of position that I was going for. Jimmy talks about being a programmer and still being a programmer. Well, I went to the same school as he did because they had a good co-op program, and he was a success story of it. I was very nearly a success story of
Right.
it, except
Yes.
that people were gambling with money in an irresponsible way, and sidetrack the world's economy.
Yes.
Oops, oops.
Turns out regulations are kind of important.
Yeah, I have a huge amount of compassion who are waylaid economically by global forces, and
Right.
that extends a long ways. But it took me a year to find a job after graduation, and it was through a connection I got from the co-op position. So yeah, I guess I'm again jumping around, but
That's okay.
um, so we are talking about loss of faith.
Yes.
So I guess I should go back to that high school, the fancy pants weirdo high school. Yeah, it's pretty high caliber people. It's a great way to go from being in line to be valedictorian at your school to being mediocre.
Right. Yeah. You're no longer the big fish in the small pool.
Yeah, and I kind of
Yeah.
preferred that. I did not mind being solidly middle of the pack of a bunch of impressive people because then you could relax about it a bit and get to know people for real and enjoy them for whatever their assets were and their flaws because you start living with a bunch of intelligent teenagers. It's not intelligence is not just an asset. It can be quite a liability, and
Mm.
people can get into weird trouble or yeah, just lots of strange people. It blew my mind in a lot of ways, and
Right.
not to mention the high caliber academic side of it, where you were being pulled, you know, by these really high standards sometimes, and I was getting bad grades for not the first time in my life, but the first time since taking ac- like academics seriously, since really caring about my homework and not just phoning it in.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So Jimmy talked about the genetics students with the tubes of fruit flies. I was one of those. Um, I didn't take the evolution class, but every biology class I took touched evolution because
Right.
what is
It's
it?
kind of important to the
Yeah,
subject.
I think Brett Weinstein said all biology is evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
It's a helpful way to step back and remember it. But yeah, everything you touch is like undermining this unnecessarily rigid faith tradition that I had. And I don't know, being the most rigid person in my family and the least well informed, just because I was the youngest and started the earliest, but didn't have the rigor to convince myself um,
Mm.
with all the apologetics or whatever. It was like, so you had some good references in his episode. Captain Cassidy was a great episode. I've re-listened to that one a few times. And that pool of faith, yeah, yeah. She talks about it in a way of, it gets filled, recharged, and then drained. But as soon as she brought up that metaphor, I thought about like, well, there are also things that blast holes in that pool. It's an above ground pool, and you can shotgun that thing.
Yes.
It's a
Catastrophic failure.
yeah, the
Yes.
holes the holes might not be all at the bottom, so you might still have stuff in the tank, but the death of my mom just
Hmm.
blasted it away.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think most of the solid deconversion or really actively thinking about it for the purpose of undermining my beliefs happened at that school. Like, I was meeting some pretty wild people who were not at all like me, but who were so much like me. Um,
Right.
and they knew I was naive and they kind of protected me from themselves, which was really interesting. It was like another expression of love, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
They broke me into the world and kept me safe. And
Yeah. That's amazing, man. It sounds like you had some incredibly good friends.
yeah, I still do have some of them, thankfully. But yeah, I mean, most of that work was there. You listen to your other episodes, it seems like people try really hard. You went through this process, Jimmy went through this process. Uh, you try really hard to hold on to your faith, and you do the research, you do the deep
Mhm.
work, and I feel so fortunate for skipping all of that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because it like I was never drawn in by attempts at rational arguments to explain this stuff because
Okay.
like when I was in high school, still in my hometown, I think we had our first taste of apologetics, and I was already on my way out. And we didn't get enough of these books, so I was actually sharing it with somebody else,
Okay.
which did a lot of damage because we went to the same school, we were friends, we were on cross country together, and the book was called The Case for Christ or Case for Christ.
Yeah. Least trouble.
Yeah, we did not read that book. We started, we I think she got farther than I did, but that book led to so much shit talking. because we both understood the scientific method. We were both in the advanced classes in middle school together and now in high school. And, we understood how to set up a falsifiable argument. And we were not seeing falsifiable arguments. And our main takeaway was, man, you are trying a little too hard. You should just stay in your lane and just,
I've got a quick story about that. My best friend, who I adore, he's absolutely still my best friend. Mm-hmm. That was the first thing that he was like, "Oh, well, I understand, you've deconverted, but will you read this book?" And I think I had read it before, but I was like, "Sure, I'll read it." In fact, I read several of them. Yeah. Like there's multiple. And it honestly just made me sad. It's like, and I'll step back one more thing here and just say there are better versions of apologetics out there.
Sure.
Lee Strobel's is particularly bad.
Okay, good to hear.
But not that they are convincing, but that they are at least maybe more rigorous, right? But yes, the Case for Christ was so bad, so egregiously, obviously wrong.
Yeah, what a gift.
Yeah, exactly. It has the exact opposite effect of its intended effect. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the only apologetics I ever touched. And I think, science is not for everything. It's not for the exploration of things that aren't falsifiable. But I'm a technically minded person. I would say my brothers are as well. I became a professional scientist for many years.
Okay.
I'm doing something else now, but it really shapes the way you think. And I never pursued excellence in science. I got my bachelor's and became a professional scientist. And so I was never on the path for tenure as a professor, or if I was going to become a senior scientist, it was because I was going to work at that thing and gain competence and then go up through a company. So my ego isn't super tied in with any, way of thinking, like how certain scientists who are successful can become sort of dogmatic about things, entrenched in their opinions of whatever their specialties are. I don't have any of that. And so my scientific thinking readily permeates the rest of my life and the way I view things.
Right.
And I think that was the main reason why I didn't go down the rabbit hole of trying to convince myself. It was really the other way. It was more like, this is a thing that seems kind of wrong, but I still can't let go of it. And so I actually need to actively work to scrub it out of my psyche.
Yeah.
Because the fear of hell really was the last thing to go. And I was in my mid-20s. And it's like almost a decade of trying to let everything go.
Okay, so a couple of comments leading to a question. One, I love the way you've described that the kind of the scientific method permeates all of your thinking. And I think it can be summarized in 2 words: error correction.
Oh, yeah.
When I am mistaken, if I discover that I am mistaken, I've learned something, that's valuable, that is something I actually want. And it is the opposite of faith. Faith is that there can never be the admission of error. There cannot be a mistake, and it has to be perfect all the time. And so those 2 things are diametrically opposed. And if I've said this a number of times, so people like Jimmy and myself who are developers, people who are in science or mathematics in the harder fields, we are proven wrong hundreds of times, sometimes hundreds of times a day. And you just get used to that. Your ego is out of the equation, and you're just, I thought it was this, it wasn't, I'm okay, I'm moving on, now I'll try the next thing. And that just becomes matter of fact. There's no identity involved in it. And when you apply that to faith, it is that catastrophic failure. It is the house of cards coming down. I've said a lot that breaks my heart when I hear people who have grown up in this faith and they have, because I came to it a little bit later, but they have that fear of hell that is ingrained. You were a child,
Yeah.
right? You had no control over what your parental figures and adults in your life were telling you. And no wonder it takes a decade to process that, right? Like that's normal, man. That is, it's just soul crushing to hear that kind of story because of the hurt that it has caused you and
Yeah.
many, many thousands of other people like you.
Yeah.
So it's, it sounds like this was a decades long process, but was there a particular moment where you thought, I really don't believe this? Like the admission to yourself, not necessarily to even anyone else, where just internally you recognize this is no longer something I accept as true.
Yeah. I think that happened late in high school. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't remember when, if it was a particular event. It probably wasn't. It was probably just something occurred that would normally bring a certain response that was colored by my faith tradition, and that response just didn't happen. I'm like, huh, maybe like a subtle recognition like that. And there were more and more of those sorts of things that happened where I was shown by just my day in and day out experience that I didn't think that way anymore. I was becoming a different person. I was actually succeeding, like growing out of it, growing away from it.
And then about what age would you say when you were you used the terms actively trying to scrub it from your psyche? That was pretty evocative.
Yeah.
When do you think you became conscious of that process?
So I was pretty relaxed about it through college, a little bit after college. But then when I actually got that job, a year after graduating, it took me to Colorado. And I think that was a new beginning. I had to start over. It wasn't, all that pleasant initially. It took a while to build a group of friends. But I was in a pretty conservative place with a lot of evangelical Christians and
Yeah.
not at all interested in plugging into that. And I think it was then. I was already big into podcasts listening then. I was an early adopter in that realm, I guess. One of the things I learned in undergrad is that I'm mostly an audio learner. It's funny what teaches you that, but I had a microbiome class that taught me that. It was a British professor, and we had essay questions in a science class, and each test was 2 essay questions, which just like blew away how I thought about science and was taught up to that point to think about science. And he would lecture, and I stopped taking notes, and I realized like I would ace the tests if I just paid attention and remained curious to what he was saying.
Interesting.
And so once I figured that out, and podcasts came on the scene, I soaked them up. And early on, it was mostly NPR programming, which, if you fill your head with that all day, it can get depressing, depending on what you're listening to. The international news of like everywhere that got bombed or whatever. So I took a pause from that. But then when I was out in Colorado, I was listening to Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, and Mark Maron was a guest. He's a comedian. One of the
and a podcast host, right?
early podcasters. Not the earliest by any means, but he mentioned on the show that he had one, and so I started downloading them and listening, and there was this like network of people. People would come on his show, and they would have podcasts, or they'd talk about somebody else's, and eventually I heard about Joe Rogan in like 2012, or I think early 2012. I started listening to him.
Okay.
And he became more and more connected to everyone. And I got this podcast app in 2015, so I have playback statistics from then, and 236 days and 22 hours. So
Yes, right.
I was a chemist. I was a bench scientist, and I walked to work often, and I just would listen to 8 to 12 hours of podcasts a day because I was so well suited to learn from them. And so I just soaked up the world through a curated lens, and a pretty strange one at times. Like, comedians were some of the early podcasters because it was a completely unregulated space. So there was truly no censorship. So you could get the full gamut of pretty well socialized people to full on degenerates. And
Yes.
because people
Yeah.
were seeking them out, they had their own audiences. They weren't offending. Like, it was all appropriate to who their audiences were. And so there were some pretty weird people out there, like Duncan Trussell, who is now pretty mainstream, but like, he's the guy who did the Midnight Gospel on Netflix. It's an animated show. It's super psychedelic. But I got exposed to some strange things um, from his show, like the occult or Gnosticism. Like, this weirdo comedian, like, pretty new agey, psycho spiritual dude, quoting the Gnostic Gospels and, like, sort of, uh, I don't know, the different guests he'd have on. They would just be in these conversations talking about stuff I didn't understand, and it was just sort of broadening my horizons. And I thought the concept of the demiurge was pretty helpful. I didn't go down the Gnostic rabbit hole because I didn't feel like I needed to replace Christianity with anything, but just the whole flipping it on its head. Well, actually, the main guy, God, Yahweh, is actually this evil force that's, working
Yes.
through, it's this, it
Yeah.
just completely flips it on its head. And just knowing that that's an option, it's like, oh, people did that and made sense of it too. And I don't need to do that, but wow, that's weird and interesting. And it's related to my baggage, but
Right.
here, take some of my baggage.
Yes.
And, all the weird occult symbology that people go back to Egyptian religions and things, and it all just seems like symbols for human metaphors and experience, common experience. And see, I'm still not even really doing the research. I'm not going and reading or listening to Joseph Campbell or um, becoming a Jungian psychologist or whatever. I'm just, tell me about that concept, and I'll think about it, and it'll change me. And that's basically how it's worked over the years. It's
Yeah.
I'm going to listen to things about science and philosophy and history, and I'm not going to know what I'm going to get. So this is a mystery unfolding in front of me that I get to engage with for hours every day. And I've toned it way down now. Um, I don't need to listen to that much. If you are avoiding something, I think it can be helpful to fill your head with other people's voices for things that you're interested in. But you definitely need silence. And that's been a lesson from my mid 20s on, you know, another coping mechanism, if you want to call it that, maybe a tool in the toolkit, meditation. So, what a big deal. Nobody nobody teaches you how your brain works. And it turns out you can teach yourself, and it's been known about for a while, you guys.
Yes. This is not new.
No, no,
Yeah.
and Sam Harris will talk straight into your ears and tell you exactly what you need to do. And he does a great job.
Mm.
But I started out with Headspace, so that's Andy Puddicombe. the British monk guy. But
Yeah.
I've been paying attention to Sam Harris for a while, since I think 2015, and he's had a big impact on my thinking. But the way he teaches meditation, I think, is the most helpful. It's the most natural feeling to me, um, and he really isn't that concerned with the methodology. He's only concerned that it works, and so he's collaborating with lots of really interesting people. David White, a poet,
Hmm.
or I mean, you could call him a philosopher. Um, there's 2 sections of his poetry on there as meditations, as practice,
Right.
which it's like I wouldn't have thought about that until it was in there. And I had the option, and I go in and listen, and I'm moved by these words read by this man who generated these words, and like tells you the story. And so he'll read it, and then he'll give you a little bit of a backdrop to what was going on and what it meant to him, but you heard it before he told you that. And so you're just seeing it sort of purely at first, and then you're getting the story, and then you're hearing it again, and it's enriched by his story and your initial understanding. And it's like just the beauty in the words and what can be evoked in you is amazing to me.
Hmm.
And I didn't have access to that early in my life. They talk about joy in Christianity, the difference between joy and happiness, and that always confused me, because joy was supposed to be this lasting, unshakable thing, and you're just told that you have it because you're a Christian. And man, that had to have played a role in undermining my faith, because I didn't feel it, I didn't understand it. And then, I leave the church. I do my best to leave my any sort of belief in it, and all of a sudden I'm like a way more Jesus-like, more Christ-like person,
Hmm.
like in my actions, what I'm motivated by. And then like joy starts peeking through, and it was disturbing at first. I talked about my mom having depression. I definitely did before she died. Um, I was struggling with no context. And then, I see her struggling in a similar way, and then she dies, and the challenges with that. And it took a while to get through and like find to peek above the clouds, I guess.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that you have, right? Like
Yeah,
you've built some tools that, you're able to live life with,
yeah,
and not just survive, but to thrive.
yeah.
I want to go back to your relationship with your brother. So, who told who first, and what was that conversation like?
Well, you mentioned sending me an email, sort of probing and finding out. So he definitely asked me first, and it caught my eye. I was wondering why he wanted to know. The idea that he was looking for support crossed my mind, but I didn't know, because he didn't reveal any of that at that time. Because it sounds like he didn't know. He was trying to figure it out.
But then, if I recall, it's actually I should have listened to it before before this conversation, but I didn't. If I recall correctly, then eventually you guys get together, like face to
Yeah,
face, and
yeah,
have a pretty long conversation. And what was that like?
yeah. That was over Christmas. That was pretty wild, because I was the last of the three to, oh, not the last of the three, but he was engaging with my middle brother more for support, because he was still in the church, and I think they had discussed these sorts of things more in the past. Um, yeah, it was pretty crazy, because in his episode he talks about not feeling alone, and like him beginning to not feel alone and opening up to me. But for me,
Right.
as soon as he said that, it was like, hold on. I've been the atheist in the family this whole time, alone, you know,
Yes.
uh, pur-
Yeah.
like purposefully detaching myself in a lot of ways, because I wasn't compatible with my own family, and it was such a strange, like, really, it was a relief that I wasn't alone, but it was also very confusing because it's like, well, part of what has made this difficult is that I have these really intelligent brothers who still believe this stuff. And,
Mm.
and one of them comes and says, nah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I, it's a real strange shift. And it was, it was at the beginning, I struggled with that whole year, basically, processing that. And we talked more and more. And I don't know, I got used to the idea, and it was still just a relief, but I wasn't alone. And that was a big change because
Yeah.
all of the people who thought this way so far had been outside of my family, or one cousin who admitted to me,
Right.
who had not come out to his parents. And I've come out to his parents.
Right.
To that uncle, like, I came out to my dad first, and that took a while, but it was just a Christmas, him driving me back to the airport. And, you know, you have that period of time where you can talk about anything because you're about to part forever, you know, for the next year or whatever.
Right.
And he asked me, and I just told him, and it was a very simple conversation. He didn't probe, but I think he had had his suspicions, and it was fine. It was fine.
Yeah. I'm sometimes amazed at actually how few questions, like, I don't, from most people,
Yeah,
I had one aunt who was curious and asked a bunch of questions, but almost everyone else is like, oh, okay.
yeah,
Like, I don't know how to process that is effectively how I interpret it, but
yeah. I don't want to go any further because I don't want to undermine my situation. I think is like a deeper down thing often.
right. Is this a topic that you talk with Jimmy about today? Is that something that is like important to that relationship, or is it just your brothers and that supersedes everything?
Yeah, yeah, we do, but it's mostly just maintaining the relationship. Like, if there's
Right.
anything new to talk about regarding it, sure, but it's not the foundation of our relationship. It's not like we're close because we're atheists.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're brothers. And we are trying to have a stronger and stronger relationship because we haven't been able to be this close before,
Right.
and now we can because, you know, our values align again.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. I want to just say one more thing, and then
Sure.
we'll wrap up. I do think it's interesting that you acknowledge that, wow, you were the one who was alone for that long period of time.
Yeah.
But I think that that's the right thing to do. And what I mean by that is, like, had you tried to convince your brothers,
Yeah.
it probably would have alienated them
Yeah.
and may have made it take longer, right?
Yeah.
I know for me personally, I don't think there's anyone in the world who could have convinced me otherwise, even the people that I cared about the most. I had to come to this on my own. I
Yeah.
had to go through the error correction process, right? I had to go through that in my own head and in a safe place by myself,
Yeah.
read, little, bits of information here or there, and then go, yeah, this doesn't make sense anymore. And I just don't think that it's possible to do that for someone else. I think we just love the people in our lives
Yeah.
who are believers still. And I really think, anyway, I think that's just really important. I could appreciate that you might feel like you got the short end of that stick, but
Well, it's just how it happened.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't resent them for it at all. And, you know, I don't think I had a good enough understanding of it at that point to even want to have this happen for them, because there's so much suffering involved in it. You almost just like want it to work out for people if it can. It's like, hey, it's easier to stay in that faith. I mean, you'll continue to have all the dysfunction that it brings, sure, but you're not aware of that when you're in it. So at least
Right.
you're not suffering in that way.
Yes. Exactly. Well, Thomas, I cannot express how grateful I am for the vulnerability you've shown. Sounds like you're a listener of the podcast. My whole thing is about having an honesty
Yeah,
contest and being real with each other. And you have absolutely lived up to that. So thank you for telling your story.
of course. It's, if I've learned anything about truth in my deconversion, is that, like, it was I lied a lot as a kid, and
Mm,
I don't really know why, but my relationship to truth became far more important outside of the church because it seemed more like a guiding value. And then
yeah.
if you pair that with vulnerability, I mean, it was not optional for me for a long time. Um, I was either going to stuff it down or it's going to look sort of something like this, you know, through tears and it's a weird you you're expected to have a certain level of connection with a person before you engage in something like that. And so I had to find a way to make deep, fast connections with people. And, it doesn't always work out. People don't want to be met with truth and vulnerability oftentimes because it takes people aback. They're not used to it. But there are people out there who are receptive and loving and kind, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We just need to find each other,
Yep.
huh?
And
Yeah.
I didn't even talk about drugs.
We'll have to have you back. You can discuss that then.
Well, if you'd like, if it would be helpful, sure. But this has been great. I really appreciate the show.
Final thoughts on the episode. Thomas does not hold back. He shows us all of the heartache and the pain of being a missionary's kid, feeling like he has no country, dealing with mental health problems with family members, the loss of his mother, the loss of his faith. That is a lot of grief that Thomas went through. And I appreciate so much him telling this story and letting us in on what that was like. I already mentioned at the intro how difficult it is for precocious kids who are asking questions and not getting solid answers back. I feel like this was a bit of that case, although it sounds like both his mother and his father were good about this process. It's still difficult. It's still hard. Thomas expressed worry because of his brothers, who were also very intelligent, and he thought they still believed, and feeling isolated because of that. What comes home in Thomas's story is that isolation, is that feeling of being alone. And the whole point of this podcast is for you, listener, to hear that going through doubt, going through some deconstruction or full-blown deconversion, you are not alone. There are many, many, many of us out here. The other thing that Thomas expressed so well was finding some secular grace from his non-believing secular friends, that during the time of his grief, it was his friends from school that were not necessarily a part of the church that actually showed him love, compassion, and caring. That's also what this podcast is about, is just the human connection is what we need. We need each other. And recognizing when someone is in grief and hurting and just being there, just saying, I'm here for you, is a huge expression of love that maybe that person isn't receiving from anyone else. I want to thank Thomas for being on the podcast, for sharing his story with such vulnerability and honesty and compassion. It was incredibly interesting to have talked to his brother Jimmy and now Thomas and get those different perspectives. Thank you to both of you for sharing your stories. The secular grace thought of the week is be the person who is present. Be the person who shows love and compassion when someone near to you needs that. And you could be almost a stranger. You could be an acquaintance. You can be a friend who has never had those kinds of deep conversations before. But when you reach out and actually show that you care about that person, not in a thoughts and prayers kind of way, but in a, hey, can I come and talk with you for 4 hours kind of way, that can have an incredible impact on a person. And that is secular grace. I wanted to mention that the message of secular grace is getting out there. It's amazing how I'm starting to hear it echoed back from various corners. I don't want to make it sound like I'm starting something religious here, but I think it's important that we recognize how much human beings need one another. We're in this moment in time where we are more isolated and more lonely than ever before. And one of my concerns is, as we lose the community of a faith community, that needs to be replaced. There is no substitute for being close to other human beings. There is no substitute. Finding your people is critically important, and being someone who could be a part of someone else's people is also important. All of that is secular grace. Just to say that I'm starting to hear from more progressive Christians and people who are in the middle of their deconstruction, they haven't deconverted yet, start to respond to this idea of secular grace, start to recognize that it is the human beings in our lives that are the magic. And I'm just excited about that. That's why I do the podcast. That's why it is important to me to talk about these things, is that as our society changes, as what we used to find purpose and meaning in community change, it's important that we are explicit with ourselves and others about what we do believe in. I believe in people. I believe in secular grace. I believe that we together are stronger than me alone or you alone. Next week, we have Daniel, who is the new co-host of the When Belief Dies podcast. So I'm very excited to share that with you. And I have been lining up new interviews. I had taken a bit of a break there, so I'm back. If you have written me an email and I haven't gotten back to you in a couple of months, I am very, very sorry. I have not been ignoring you. It's just been incredibly busy. And I feel like I'm ramping back up, and I'll try to reach out back to everyone. And if you're considering telling your story in the podcast, please email me, gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google Deconversion, you can Google Secular Grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.